Hi everyone, welcome. Normally I bring you in at the point where I'm actually opening the container and getting to work on my worm bins, but today I felt like I needed to size up the situation in my two oldest systems in which I've already initiated the migration of the worms. That started 50 days ago, and then after 41 days I did the first haul out, which was 9 days ago at this point, and 9 days ago we actually used the worms that came out of this plus this bin's sister bin or twin bin or whatever you want to call it. The first haul out of the worms out of these two European nightcrawler worm bins has already occurred, but I put a little bit of a pause in between horizontal migration number 1 and horizontal migration number 2, which is what I want to get started here today. So horizontal migration number 1, like I mentioned earlier, went for weeks and weeks, and I thought that perhaps the reason it took so long was that maybe the material was just still so damp and comfortable for the worms to remain in, that was the reason that they weren't moving out and looking to get into more comfortable material. So I thought that perhaps if I left the material just to dry for a while before I initiate the next horizontal migration, then maybe we'd get better results on the next try. And then I even announced during haul out number 1 9 days ago that I would just do the reset of the horizontal migration feeding zones in these two bins. I've got another bin just like this that we're going to do right when we're done with this one. So I did announce that I would be doing the reset off camera, but you know, some people suggested that, hey, why not film it? You know, it's all interesting worm farming content, different people trying to do different things at different times with their worm bins might want to see it. So I figured, what the heck, let's just roll the camera and video the reset of this system to get the horizontal migration started again. So I got my handy little brush here. Stuff works really good at moving stuff aside, especially if the stuff is dry enough not to clump and stick. And I guess usually the amount of material that sticks to your gloves is also a pretty good telltale as to how wet or dry the material in your bins are. You know, not to mention just the fluidity of the material. Does it flow? Does it clump? What does it do? You know, regrettably, the system did get so damp, I believe, that it resulted in a lot of material that simply doesn't want to release from itself. You could see as I start to crumble some of these little boulders apart, they do break apart pretty readily. So the drying has occurred enough already that the material is starting to flake with a little bit of help. But I think that just the material that is clumpy like this has within it that little bit of extra moisture that seems to be preventing all the material from being able to crumble and flow. But it's getting pretty close, you know. So I've already taken the time, I did it yesterday already, to take some hunks of cardboard. I usually use these just to keep my nice clean castings separate from the stuff that's going to be over in the feeding zone. And this way I feel like when it comes time to harvest these castings, they are going to remain nice and clean, free of any sort of debris like shredded paper or cardboard or leaf fragments or anything like that. I guess the only thing I was sort of debating on was exactly how large should the feeding zone be. I guess about that size seems about right. So I guess usually what I'll do is I'll wait on the backfilling of the partition until I've already got some material loaded down into the horizontal migration feeding zone. I went out to my freezer, the one that's out in the garage where I'm storing all kinds of goodies for the worms. I bought in a variety of stuff that I hope is going to get the worms mobilized and moving over here to grab some of the food that I've laid out for them. Now I've got a piece of kind of, I don't know what this is. This was underneath the pizza that I ate yesterday. And it seemed like material that could be composted. And then even after I had finished the haul out of the worms from this system 9 days ago and just left the system to sit for a while, it It did seem to me after a while that perhaps the material had dried to the point where it didn't need any more drying, so that's why I put these pieces of paper on top of these containers to try to stifle any further evaporation or moisture loss from the bins. So I thought that maybe if we were to wrap the delicious foods into paper pieces like this, now we've got 5 pretty good sized pieces, then maybe later if we wanted to try to separate the worms from the material that they're inhabiting, it might be easier if the paper was larger chunks of stuff like this. So that was kind of my thinking. I do have my shredded paper on the ready as well if we wanted to use some of that, but I did sort of like the idea of maybe having material that would be, you know, very easy to separate the worms from the surrounding stuff. And I mean, if we were to bundle some food into these pieces of paper, we would have 5 little bundles about this size. It does seem like we might just need some of that shredded paper cardboard mix to fill in the rest of the space in here anyway, because it is going to be left with some voids and gaps at the end, which will need backfilling. So now I'm going to try to divide up the stuff that I just showed you into 2 portions, because we've got a second bin to do the same treatment with. So even down to what's in this little bag, which is not melon rinds, but rather, what do we got here? Looks like broccoli, perhaps some pear. Is this just the pears of, yeah, peels off of some pears. So let's see if we can fairly distribute what's in this little Ziploc bag so that it goes only halfway for this bin and then remains with the other half for the other bin. Doesn't have to be a perfect split. So this piece of brown paper will have this assortment of what appears to be broccoli and pear in it. We'll plop that right down into the center over here. And now we can start coming in with a little bit of watermelon. Into bundle number 2. And let's see, a little bit of cantaloupe melon into bundle number 3. I suppose if I were to run low on food for this, I could always shoot back out to the freezer and bring some more. But I suppose if I'm careful, I might be able to divvy this up in a way that leaves enough to get the other system set up in an equal way. So maybe these last 2 bundles can include a combination of both cantaloupe rind and watermelon rind. And it does seem like we've depleted enough of this stuff that I might need to take a quick pause between this bin and the next bin to go get just a little bit more with which we can set up the other bin for this same process here. So I'm assuming that as all this stuff that we dropped in here begins to thaw out, it's going to create a great deal of moisture, which I assume that the worms are going to sense and be attracted to. So hopefully it brings them running. I've also got a little bit of coffee, which I thought would just sort of get sprinkled in here right on top. And in a way, we've even got ourselves a feeding zone indicator. Not that we're going to have any trouble figuring out where the feeding zone was. And I'm just sort of following tradition here. Every time I put coffee in nowadays, I also have a tendency to drop in a little bit of my worm chow. And now I'm starting to feel like perhaps what we've established here doesn't even need any shredded paper cardboard. It does almost feel like what we've got set up here would be sufficient. Although I do somehow feel like some sort of covering on top of this would be beneficial. So you know what the heck, let's just grab a little bit of this stuff, sprinkle it in on top. Besides shredded paper and cardboard, this does include some leaf particles too, and it's dampened. Still feels to me like some sort of a piece of paper on here would be nice, and I guess that could be this in part. but it doesn't cover everything. But you know what? I believe to keep everything over here nice and damp and from losing its moisture content, I'm going to cover this with plastic. So that whatever moisture gets in here as a result of all the delicious foods that we put in here, it should just stay put without evaporating. And I kind of figured that perhaps this point where I folded this over would be about the depth that this would come to if I backfilled. So why don't we just go ahead and proceed with the backfilling of the finished compost against the partition. Try to get things leveled off here. And then I'll have to round up some sort of a plastic covering that can be placed over here to keep the moisture from being lost out of this horizontal migration feeding zone. So here in ENC bin number 1, we've now reinitiated the migration of the worms out of the material that they're inhabiting. So I'm gonna have to put a plastic cover on here, but I could do that off camera. I believe what I'm gonna do next is also go out and get a little bit more stuff with which we can replenish the feeding zone, or to rebuild the feeding zone in bin number 2. Probably don't need much. Maybe I can even pull it off with what's there. And then obviously we got to get bin number 2 out here. So why don't I get to work on that, and we'll pick up where we left off momentarily. All right, bin number 2 is out here on the bench, and the big question is, have we got enough material to load up 5 new bundles to get the feeding zone in this system started? I'd like to think so. I'm just starting to wonder about the integrity of this piece of paper as far as using it to create bundles, because it is pretty torn up, a little bit nibbled away by some worm traffic. So we'll do what we can. We'll create 4 bundles out of this, and I've got that other half of the brown paper that was in the pizza box. And now we're kind of ready to start into the reset of the feeding zone over here as well. So now I didn't get a chance to till around and explore this system. I guess the only reason I did it in the other system was because I really was up in the air in terms of how to handle the extraction of the worms out of this material. I had also, I guess part of the reason the brush is even here on the bench is because I did even contemplate the prospect of maybe using a light migration method to just get the worms to dive down into the material that they're inhabiting, and then scoop off the finished castings once it's been evacuated, and then you just kind of rinse, repeat that process over and over. As the worms continue diving deeper, you continue skimming layers off the top surface, collecting all the evacuated castings until you're left with just a pile of worms at the very bottom, covered in just a thin layer of the castings material. And the other thing I noticed too as I was going through that other bin was how these little boulders, still holding moisture in themselves, were quite plentiful still. Luckily soft enough that I can break them apart, because sometimes when worm castings get wet and clump this way, if they're allowed to dry rapidly, they become like little stones and they're just almost impossible to break apart. But when they're damp, like this stuff, since it was sort of submerged down within the bed, it can be broken apart, and each time I do, I feel like I'm sort of releasing a little bundle of moisture into the bin, or a little bit of damp material. And the other thing I did, as I was going through the other container, examining it, sort of breaking up little clumps, I was also removing little stuff like that. I mean, I've got a whole jumble of it here that I had removed from bin number 1. I don't think we're going to go to that trouble here. We're just going to get the reset of the horizontal migration feeding zone in this one going, and then these systems will once again be underway with the depopulation of the finished castings, so that hopefully we can get haul out number 2 going one of these days soon. reuniting these straggler worms with the worms that were already removed from this material in haul out number 1 9 days ago. I just can't seem to resist, you know, reaching for, I guess not even reaching because it's already in my hand, you know, kind of as I plow through the material and I sense larger clumps, I just want to keep breaking them into smaller and smaller pieces. Because as I do, I know I'm releasing the moisture that's holding it together. Sometimes even liberating a piece of cardboard or something. Like I bet you this thing right here might have came out of one of the larger chunks that I broke apart. And it's often stuff like this that I believe is causing the clumping of the material, almost like a snowflake. I think they say a snowflake always begins with like a little piece of dust onto which the moisture particles begin collecting. You know, sometimes when you see bundles of worms like this, I don't think that they're huddling around some sort of piece of scrap material that was somehow magically left behind in this material. I think that they're actually huddling like that, sort of protecting themselves from the encroaching dryness of the material that they're in. So I think that is sort of a defensive posture in the worms when they begin huddling like that, and there's no clear reason for them to be doing so as far as something that's attracting them to that one location. It's really just the mass of all the other worms around them that's drawing them to that point in the hopes that they can get some protection from the material that they're in. And that always makes me worry too. Once I start seeing that behavior in the worms, it starts to tell me that perhaps the material is becoming a little bit too dry for them. And that is sort of paradoxical, right? It doesn't really jive with what I was saying before, that each of these bundles has moisture, excess moisture, holding it together still. But it is sort of a weird environment where the little chunks are holding together because of what I believe to be possibly excess moisture, or maybe they're just still stuck together from when there was still excess moisture here. But no, I could feel it. It's still muddy, a little clumpy. But all the stuff that is now flowing loosely is pretty dry, and possibly even drier than the worms would prefer to be in. So hopefully we've gotten this stuff to the point where the worms are going to be fairly motivated to go find themselves something a little bit more comfortable, and that's what we're going to create for them now. Create a nice, freshly rebuilt second horizontal migration feeding zone for them, in the hopes that we can get them to come on over and gather together in the bounty of delicious, damp, delicious foods that we're going to be laying out for them, as well as some fresh bedding to hang out in once they've come over. And then the likelihood of them wanting to get back into this old material hopefully is low. But I just can't seem to want to keep breaking apart these little clusters, these little moisture bombs that I keep finding everywhere. I guess the ideal situation would have been if I had never let the material get so damp that it would even start clumping together in that way. Because then it always seems like once it does, you're always in for a certain period of recovery. You know, you need to try to remedy the situation, and a lot of times, you know, leaving that stuff submerged in material like this that is a little bit drier, the moisture content of it does seep out gradually. It does eventually want to allow itself to be broken apart, and then maybe at some point in the future this material would all flow loosely. But to me, this just doesn't seem like the ideal batch of worm castings when it's all in little boulders and little marbles like this. So whatever, I guess I'm trying harder to avoid the buildup of excess moisture in my systems to prevent that from happening in the future. So once again, I've got the next little partition set up for this system, and we can just follow suit with what we did before. We'll load up these 5 little bundles and position them down in the feeding zone for the wormies. All of this stuff being frozen is going to have a tendency to release its moisture content as it thaws, especially the melon. And then I think it's going to pretty much soak all of this dry paper that we're using to wrap stuff in. So I don't think that there should be any concern over the moisture level down in here. And I almost feel like I might have bought so much melon to supplement what we started with earlier that I might even have more now than what we built bin number 1's horizontal migration feeding zone with. But guess what? We're just going to use it all. I'm not looking to do anything else with this except what we're doing here. And if this one has just a slightly greater quantity of food in its horizontal migration feeding zone, that's fine. And if you think about this as food, a lot of it is just moisture. If you were to allow for all the moisture in this material to just drain out and you were left with only dry material at the end, I don't think that there'd be a whole lot of stuff left over. Like, you know, the weight of this. As I hold it in my hands, I could feel a good amount of weight, and I believe that it is for the most part moisture. So here's the last of it. It does seem like it's a pretty equal amount to what we used to create horizontal migration feeding zone in bin number 1. Even from the amount that seems to stick up off the bottom of the bin. Very cool. Now we're just going to follow suit with what we did earlier in terms of setting up the feeding zone with the coffee. But you know what? I think at this point we've got enough material that's going to permit us to also proceed with the backfilling of the partition with the contents of the container. So this way I don't have to hold the partition wall. At this point it's standing pretty straight up on its own. And then we can complete the setup by dropping in coffee. Hopefully all stuff that the worms appreciate and enjoy nibbling on once they arrive over here to partake in the moisture and the food and the fresh bedding and everything else. And then like we did before too, we're just going to treat them to a little bit of this over here too. Perhaps not enough to entirely cover the feeding zone, but the feeding zone I think will at the end be more thoroughly covered with the plastic. So I went over to the other one, to bin number 1, and I did already apply the plastic covering to it. And I'll do the same here once I've returned this system back over to the bench and put some plastic over here to protect the moisture content of the feeding zone. And so it continues back to migration with these worms after a 9-day hiatus. So that's the end of the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.